We are Mythvision,
home of Mythvision podcast and Mythvision radio group. My co-host is Derek Lambert. I'm Dr. Luther G. Williams, and today's program is made possible through a donation by a subscriber. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us. Make sure you do three things. Step one, we put the book in Facebook, so go ahead and like us. Step two, be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube, but don't just stop there. Post a comment and share the link, will you? And step three, supercharge your Mythvision experience by visiting our PayPal and Patreon accounts darting across your screen. Well, today, folks, we've got not one, but two, count them, two favorites of our listeners. Author Joseph Atwill, a proponent of Roman provenance theory of Christianity, and author Dr. Robert M. Price, representing atheistic mythicism. They'll have a free and open discussion of what I call RPT and AM. Now, this, once again, is not a contest or a debate. There are no winners or losers in this, except for everybody who wins by checking out the show to hear these two exceptional authors and scholars. You may have seen that this episode of the show is entitled The Empire Strikes Again. That may ring a familiar bell with some of you. And one of our favorite listeners has come back to say hello. He's everybody's favorite Jedi gone bad, the guy we love to hate, Mr. Heavy Breathing himself. Please welcome Darth Vader. What's up, Darth?
Mythvision has made history by bringing Roman provenance theory and atheistic mythicism together in conversation. The Emperor is pleased, but you must continue. We do not wish to withdraw our support from your PayPal and Patreon accounts. That is all.
Darth, Derek and I check our PayPal and Patreons regularly, and we didn't see any contribution from you or the Empire. With all those planets that you raid across the galaxy, you should invest some of that in our show. See, your empire is cheap. That's why it took you 8 years to build the Death Star when it should have taken 6 months. So if you want us to have a certain type of programming, you have to do like everybody else and help support us, okay? Thanks. And friends, you don't have to have the wealth of the Empire to support us. No gift is too small. Isn't that right, Derek?
That's absolute truth, guys. We have brought two fantastic scholars. I look up to both of them, and I call them friends. The last time they met wasn't as pleasant as this time will be, because these gentlemen are now able to communicate on ideas. Sometimes it takes time to let things digest. Sometimes we got to chew on ideas and thoughts. But I will have to say, if I'm going to pat myself on the shoulder, Mythvision, as we were once called the Water Boys, is known for taking scholarship and having them communicate. We like to connect the dots, because there's no way to truly test these theories without having the person who's the proponent of this position come and present it. And then you allow the others to chew and spit out different ideas. And that's one of my favorite things. I kind of never put concrete in any bucket, so to speak. I test all ideas, and I think that's a good thing, being a free thinker. Joseph Atwill is an independent scholar, lecturer, the author of Caesar's Messiah, The Secret Hidden History of Christianity and the Gospels, and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. He's discussed his theories on the origin of Christianity on BBC, Fox News, and Russia's REN network. His website is caesarsmessiah.com, where his book may be purchased and questions and comments posted. You can send emails directly to joeatwill@gmail.com. That's joeatwill@gmail.com. I'll put this in the description so you guys can see it. Please be kind in your emails, by the way. He doesn't get always the best emails sometimes, as we talked about earlier. So, Luther?
Our other special guest and a great friend of ours is Dr. Robert Price. He's an American theologian and writer known for arguing against the existence of a historical Jesus. known as the Christ myth theory. Dr. Price taught philosophy and religion at the Johnny Coleman Theological Seminary. He's a professor of biblical criticism at the Center for Inquiry Institute and the author of a number of books on theology and the issue of the historicity of Jesus, including Deconstructing Jesus, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, Jesus is Dead, and the Christ myth theory and its problems. A former Baptist minister, Dr. Price, was the longtime editor of the Journal of Higher Criticism. And the Journal of Higher Criticism is still active, by the way. It's still going on, and we'd like you to support that. We'll say more about that later. Dr. Price is also a fellow of the Jesus Seminar, a group of over 100 writers and scholars who study the issue of the historicity of Jesus. He's the organizer of a web community for those of you who are interested in the history of Christianity. Dr. Price is a religious skeptic, especially of Orthodox Christian beliefs, and occasionally and famously describes himself as a Christian atheist. He's an outspoken critic of biblical literalism, arguing for a more skeptical and humanistic approach to Christianity. Mr. Atwill, Dr. Price, welcome to our show. I want to say friends, glad to have you.
Oh, glad to be here.
Pleasure to be here.
You know, I have a theory about the lack of financial support from Lord Vader. I suspect he was willing to hand over the cash on the misunderstanding that the imperial provenance was that of the empire he serves, the Galactic Empire, whatever it's called. And then somebody told him, no, it's the Roman Empire. And he said, well, in that case, forget it.
Yes!
Just a theory. I don't know.
That's entirely reasonable, Dr. Price. I think that's it. That's right. I tell you, the guy pulled the plug on us. What can you say, right?
That's too funny. Okay, I'm leaving. I can't stay any longer.
No. Come on. We got lots
What can you say after that? It's hilarious.
Well, you guys
pray I do not change our deal further.
You're going to say exactly what needs to be said. Let's start with you, Bob. Bruno Bauer writes about Christ as the incarnation of the zeitgeist, the prevailing mood or spirit of the first century. And that spirit transcended national boundaries. I love Hellenistic syncretism, everything that it represents. I think Derek feels that way too. Its vascular system, if you want to look at it that way, was the network of Roman roads. And you got all these influences coming into Palestine, the gymnosophists and the believers in Isis and Thoth and you name it. That movement seemed to go against Jewish nationalism, didn't it? Tell us a little bit about how you see the spirit of the times in the first century. Let's start with you, Bob.
Well, it's true that there was both militant Jewish opposition to the spirit of the age, especially the syncretism aspect of it, but they got upset for the simple reason that there were many Jews who didn't feel that way and were quite happy to Hellenize, or as Bauer said, Romanize Judaism. That's what always happens in revitalization movements the world over. There's a sudden clash of cultures, and and many people in the native culture like what they're seeing, the technology, beliefs, you name it, and they begin to either just switch over to the religion that is always the kind of figurehead of any culture, or they at least begin to mix their religion with that, perhaps in just style or sometimes in substance. An example of that having nothing to do with Judaism, but present in the ancient world, was Alexander the Great's Hellenizing program for the empire he conquered. And as a result, even today you find old statues of the Buddha who is made to look like Apollo. And of course, the earliest representations of Jesus also make him look like Apollo. And this is the same kind of thing. There are, I think, second century synagogues that have elaborate mosaics depicting Zeus in a chariot flying through the wheel of the zodiac, or Hercules. And what on earth? Well, there's a casket, an elaborate sarcophagus from Egypt, for a wealthy Jew with the menorah on it and the wheel symbolizing the resurrection of Attis. Well, it's obvious that there were Jews that said, "Hey, let's get with it. There's nothing threatening about this." But like in the books of the Maccabees, there were Jews that said, if we let our guard down, there's not going to be any Judaism because everybody will assimilate. And of course, this is still a huge danger in Judaism today. Interfaith marriages, nobody says they're immoral, but a lot of rabbis will warn against it and say, wait a minute, if you do this, I know love conquers all, but it may conquer Judaism. We don't want that to happen. I mean, if you're celebrating Chrismica or something, soon you're just going to be celebrating Christmas, and because the gifts are better and so on. Well, that happens all over the world, and militant revitalization movements decide, okay, to hell with this. We're rejecting the foreign influence, even if we have to kill the people that inside or outside our community that are jumping on that bandwagon, because if we don't, that's it for our culture. Now, they may, new religions may form, because what they're barring from the front door slips in the back door, because you try to take either elements of the religion of the new culture or the conquering culture and use them against the culture to which it belongs, like the technology. How did the Ayatollah Khomeini take over in Iran? Well, he was against modern Western ways, but he couldn't have done what he did without Western technology. And this is always the way it is. And sometimes they'll say, well, you know, their gods were strong enough to beat us. Maybe we should incorporate some of that. But then the real, the hardcore traditionalists will say, I'm sorry, you're destroying the traditional way now. You're coming up with a heresy. A third thing, and if they survive, you may have yet another religion. Well, this is nothing esoteric. It's quite reasonable. You can see why people do it, and so you've got both versions in the Old Testament and the Apocrypha and so on. And one of the great ironies is that Josephus points out the similarity between Pharisaic Judaism and Stoicism, similar doctrines and so on, not necessarily influenced, but similar ideas. And when you look at 4th Maccabees, now in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you've got this violent revolt against the Seleucids, who were Hellenizers, right? And so they're taking up arms against them. But by the time you get to 4th Maccabees, they're using the example of the Maccabean martyrs to proof text for Stoicism, that it shows the supremacy of reason. And you find that in the Epistle of James, too. It's got law, Torah, keeping Judaism with Stoic ideas. So even there, eventually syncretism kind of takes over. And Bauer said that he thought that Mark, whoever he was, had created the character of Jesus because he was influenced by Stoicism. That Seneca said, you know, it would be a real good idea if everybody chose an ideal figure and personified him, kind of an imaginary friend, admittedly, and asked, you know how people were saying for a long time, what would Jesus do? I once thought it was great to have and I can understand that. That's not a bad question, though I did have the idea of doing a badge showing Jerry Seinfeld's face and saying WWJD. What would Jerry do? But anyhow, he said that other people picked this one and that one, and you would ask, what would so-and-so, what would Pericles say about this? And this is what eventually popped up again in Christianity, is your personal relationship with Christ. They hardened it into saying, I'm not just imagining, what would he think of me? He'd I'd probably look pretty bad. Maybe I shouldn't do it. But Seneca already said, imagine somebody looking possibly askance at what you're thinking of doing, and don't do it. And he said that's where he got the idea of Jesus from. But he made it up. There was no such person, nor did there need to be. And so that about Bruno Bauer's theory about the creation of Jesus by Mark is a prime example of this cosmopolitan syncretism where Roman Hellenism influenced Christianity.
Joe, what do you think on that? What do you think on that, Joe? Because I know you have similar ideas, but you would also incorporate Titus into this, or at least Vespasian and Titus. So,
are you asking what I see as the spirit of the times? Or
Right.
But with the literature as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything Robert said. I think that's exactly correct. From the Roman perspective, they would want to continue with the process of the Hellenization or Romanization of the Jews. I mean, the family of Herod was certainly part of that process. But to what extent the Jewish people were divided upon this line, there's no way to know. We don't have any, sort of demographic counts as far as, well, who was buying the Roman Judaism and who was fundamental. What we do know is that it was a century of warfare, and the warfare continued into the 2nd century, right? If you look at the what's called the Bar Doma rebellion in 115, the island of Cyprus, I believe, was depopulated. The Jews gained military control and genocided the Gentiles. Areas around what's now present-day Libya was depopulated to the extent that Rome had to have a program to repopulate them. And these concepts, which are in, I think you can get them in, Dio, I think, actually recorded these things. But they're real because they actually have documents they found down the Nile where the Roman magistrate of Alexandria was trying to escape. He recorded this fact, he's trying to get away from the Jews. So anyway, what you have is a national movement. It's not a fringe, religious perspective. And I would say that what was the spirit of the times, it depends completely on which side of the line you would cross over to. The spirit of the Jews who were not buying the Hellenization was warfare. I mean, from Judas the Galilean all the way through to the Bar Kokhba rebellion. It was just one really, really genocidal war after another. A little tidbit is that when the general returned after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, you're supposed to give a salutation when you enter Rome after your triumph, and it wasn't given that one time because the Romans had lost so many men in the battle that they were afraid there'd be a rebellion among the population. So, and of course, in the 66-73 rebellion, they basically set up a nation state right inside the Roman Empire, right? They were minting coins, So basically it was Eretz Israel, and it was a militarized Judaism. I think that's the spirit of the times, and the Gospels are fascinating. Just irrespective of the different theories about them, because they are kind of a dividing literature. You see, Jesus talks about events from the war. He predicts them. The Galilean town's going to get crushed. Jerusalem's going to be encircled with a wall. You'll have the abomination of desolation. The temple's going to get razed. These are basically military victories from the coming war. And of course, one thing that's often overlooked is that the character, the human Passover lamb, is completely back calculated and wired into the war. It's one thing that I always am sort of disappointed in, New Testament scholarship, is that they don't see the obvious 40-year parallel between the first Passover lamb and then the entering into the promised land, the ownership of the old covenant of Israel, and the 40 years from the date of Jesus's crucifixion. He's representing the Passover lamb of the new covenant, and then 40 years to the day you have the fall of Masada, and at that point, then the new covenant now has the change of ownership, and they own all of Israel, right? So but the fact is that shows that the literature was completely wired into the war, right, tip to stern. So what you're looking at, in my opinion, is the spirit of the age was warfare, and the Gospels fit into this perspective. I agree with Robert, though. I mean, how the thought world of the authors represents a kind of like syncretic philosophy. And in fact, that may have been like one of the very primary drivers of the literature, is they basically wanted to like continue with the idea of like, well, let's get these guys away from the fundamentalism and into a more modern philosophy like Stoicism, from which they can, like abide inside the Roman Empire. But nevertheless, the literature is reflecting the warfare of the era. That I think is the spirit of the literature. It is reacting to that spirit, and it's trying to move one of the political version or political reason for the literature is to move people, Jews who read it, more toward the kind of Herodian Sanhedrin Jew, who is able to live within the Roman Empire and not this fundamental, zealot that wants to rebel.
I like that. That makes perfect sense. Luther?
Derek, how about you? You got a question for either of our guests, or you want me to, or you just want me to continue?
I'll say a statement if you don't mind, and then if you don't mind continuing. Robert Eisenman was on our show recently, and he made a very clear statement. He's getting up there in age. We're trying to get him while he's still got some prime left in him, and he made a statement while on the program, and me and Luther could not let this statement go. He said there were two types of Jews, technically, or two types of people. You had your Romanized, and then you had your anti. It was like what the Gospels declare, the sheep and the goat. It's like you had this, like what you were mentioning here, Joe, and I like how you delved into the synchronistic ideas, Dr. Price, with the whole, like the philosophy. There's like there's many levels to this at which it's working, and you're showing kind of a science of how it would develop. And Atwill's explaining the history in which this developed and saying, this is, guys, the house is burning down. We need something now that's going to fix this solution. And it seems that the Gospels would serve some purpose like that. So he says that there's pro-Roman and anti-Roman. No matter how you chop it up, that Jews were either for or against Rome is how he kind of put it. There was no fence-sitting Jew, so to speak. I don't know. Maybe you have a comment on that, and Luther, if you wanted to continue.
Hey, Derek.
Yep.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if my mic was on. Okay, right. Yeah, I mean, you captured it. It wasn't that a remarkable statement by Eisenman? In fact, he went so far as to say that the pro-Roman, anti-Roman divide was the major bifurcating principle in Palestine that cut across all groups, all sympathies, all factions. This is how you characterized the various groups in Palestine. I thought that was marvelous.
Well, I have a question for Robert. Well, one, do you agree with Eisenman's thought? And then if so, how would you, like, just from the perspective of like the people who believe in Jesus, how would that character have fit into such a political landscape?
Well, I think that this fits in well to the Roman provenance theory. It's independently of whether you think there was or was not a historical Jesus, because if you could say, well, Jesus was the creation of someone, the Romans or Romanized Jews or whatever, to pacify the militants. But you could also say, a la SGF Brandon and Eisenman sort of getting close to this, you could say that, oh yeah, there was a historical Jesus and some leftover bits in the Gospels, like if you don't have a sword, go out and sell the cloak off your back and buy one, and the kingdom of God advances with violence, and violent men seize it by force, and all this stuff, or in the cleansing of the temple. It kind of looks like that someone didn't quite erase all the evidence of Jesus having been like somebody like Judas of Galilee or Menachem or Simon Bar Kokhba, that he was a religious, violent revolutionary, but that somebody, after the fall of Jerusalem, decided that this would just endanger them, and so they kind of pacified the portrait of Jesus and created a new Roman-friendly propaganda version reflecting their own views. I don't want to make it sound like cynical advertising executives. Who knows? But it's you certainly could envision, like you had similar things happening, like it looks like one theory about the rise of apocalyptic, the rise of Gnosticism was who was the guy? C.K. Barrett, The Gospel of John and Judaism. He said that given the miserable, tragic failures of Jewish revolution against Rome, they just went out to a different model of salvation, an otherworldly one that made this world irrelevant, and you wanted to escape it, and after death and so on. Well, this would have been this sanitizing of the revolutionary Jesus would be a similar move to be able to live without the war, to make Jesus a pacifist, not a warrior anymore. In fact, you have the same kind of thing happening today in Islam, where there are these militant Muslims that will kill you if you're not even their sect. But on the other hand, you have people that want to accommodate to Western culture and still say, oh yeah, we're good Muslims. Jihad, oh, that just refers to an inner struggle of against your own sins. Well, it's obvious that is an attempt to whitewash traditional Islam, and I'm glad they're doing it. That's much safer. But it's the same kind of thing, to differentiate yourself from a militant form of your religion that's already killed enough people. And so this would make perfect sense if there had been a Jesus who was crucified because he was a would-be king of the Jews, and these Christians are saying, well, we can't deny that, but it was all a frame-up. He never would have thought of it. He wouldn't hurt a fly, and so on. And they would have, in effect, been returning to the stance of the Sadducees, right? Because they didn't like Roman paganism, but they said there's just no reason to volunteer to be martyred. You can't win a war against these people. Let's come to some kind of livable accommodation. So, and I think Eisenman was the first that made it clear to me just how anti-messianic the gospel Jesus is. And one last thing, you know how theologians always say, you know, Jesus kept his messiahship secret because he didn't define it the way everybody else did, and he didn't want to create a stumbling block. Well, in other words, if you're completely redefining Messiah, what you're saying is that Jesus didn't claim to be the Messiah, and here, but even though he knew he was, and that whole thing is a long after the fact way of trying to say, well, yeah, he was the Messiah, but he's not what you think, and not what they thought, or not what he thought, in my opinion. So Jesus would fit in very neatly into this scenario as a militant, a revolutionist, and that his the one faction of his followers said, we got to clean this thing up if we want to survive.
What are your thoughts, Joe? I want to hear what you think about this and how you put all this together, because I love how you're wrestling ideas here, Price. And Joe, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, I again, I don't really dispute Robert's position. I would say that, following the war, like one important perspective is recorded in the Talmud, where the founder of rabbinical Judaism, Zakkai, is in a fantasy scenario, is actually has a dialogue with Vespasian, and outside of the city of Jerusalem, and he says, Vespasian, all these messianic prophecies, we were kind of confused about them, but the fact is they were predicting you. Mm. Okay, now this is absolutely critical in my opinion, because this confirms the position that the Roman court historians held. Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio, they all said the same thing, and of course Josephus as well, that the Jewish messianic prophecies foresaw the Roman Caesar. And to me, this is, again, we're back to this dividing moment, where the Messiah has to fall on one side or the other. Is it going to be a zealot or a Roman citizen? And so the Gospels are basically, in my opinion, propaganda on one level to just, create a kind of a foundation by which the process can go forward where the Messiah can fall on the Roman side. But it's in terms of like Caesar's Messiah theory, you have this character, the Son of Man, that Jesus envisions, and he's going to come during the war. Perhaps Robert might want to dispute it, but I just think it's just absolutely, it's in defiance of the text to read it any other way. This guy is going to come during the war, and at that time, these Roman military victories, which occurred during the 66-73 war, will occur. But if you look at that idea in the context of the Talmud's, recording of Zakkai's application of the messianic prophecies to the Caesars, there's no confusion, right? The Son of Man is going to be Caesar. That's just a straightforward reading of the text, and so. Now you can see that you have crossed the dividing line, and you have defined the Messiah as not just in cryptic terms, as basically will be the leader of the Roman authorities, right? So the Gospels are hard to understand. People have had such a hard time making sense out of them, but in general, if you just replace, except in one case, the expression "the Son of Man" with like Roman Caesar, then they would actually be coherent. All of the prophecies would make sense. Jesus would make sense as a Messiah that has this strange pro-Roman perspective, and of course the mysterious prophecies that Jesus makes would all make perfect sense, right? So I think that. The hard thing with Christianity is really getting to like an understanding of what the text is. The question about a historical Jesus, I think, is like an artificial one. I don't think it could ever be answered, and I don't think that you can prove a negative, and particularly, with so little data to work with. I think the real question for people to understand the religion and how it relates to history is to try to determine what is the genre of literature dealing with. And I think that it is demonstrable that the Gospels are tip to stern typology. Every passage, every story, they're all based one way or another on other stories. People know, of course, or have have often understood that the Old Testament was used as the basis for lots of the stories. I show that what remains, you can actually use events from the history of the war that Josephus wrote. And at that point, you have a way of understanding the literature as it's typologic literature. It's not an attempt at history. The character Jesus is not a character from a history. He's a character from a typologic literature, and therefore he's a fictional character. This, I think, is important, getting back to Robert's perspective, because you can now, I think, without any sort of confusion, understand Jesus as part of what the Roman authorities were hoping to have was a continuation of the process by which I would say what can in general be called Stoic philosophies could be brought into the Jewish religion, so that they just wouldn't rebel so often, so there wouldn't be so much violence. So that's my take on it.
Joe, I think I do too. Derek, you want to say something?
I just want to comment and say that I've been watching you, Price, for a very long time, and you talk about, and one of your favorite things, in fact, you're currently writing a book, and I was hoping you'd twist Joe's arm a little during this interview and say, hey, Joe, you want to help join this cause?
Incidentally, when I didn't really understand, just to digress, but yeah, I'm definitely going to write the chapter that the gentleman asked me to do, because
great.
I was going to mention. I think what confused me is I didn't know Robert M. was involved with it. If I had known that, it just came at me from the I hate to say it, but I mean, particularly since I have a different, there's a couple like New Testament scholars that I am just completely infatuated with, and Robert M. is at the top of the list, and it's just an honor to have a piece and stuff that he's involved with. So I'm happy to do it. And please, I've already started the process, so don't worry. I'll be doing the Roman provenance chapter in the book, and I think the book will be a lot of fun for people to read.
I'm so delighted and relieved to hear that.
We're delighted too, man. That's cause for celebration. You heard it on our show, folks.
Yes, I'm actually working on it. Right, I haven't started, but I started in the sense I've begun to procrastinate, and so that's the first step.
Talk about the delay of the parousia.
Right. Hey, wait a minute, guys.
I'm definitely going to write the chapter.
Great, thank you.
You guys are segueing into my next question beautifully.
Okay, take it, Luther. I'll jump on this later.
Well, no, Joe said it. He says, I have begun to procrastinate. Okay, Occam's razor cuts out all the unnecessary steps and goes right to it. And Joe, you do a fantastic job of that, I think. So if we're talking about this militaristic figure, okay, in the first century, and there's some evidences of him, as Robert said, maybe even left in the scripture. But why do we need a Jesus when we have other militaristic figures we're talking about? It would seem to me that the invention of a Jesus violates Occam's razor because we don't need him. If the Romans are adept at making literature that parodies actual figures in the militancy, pick Judas of Galilee, mess him up. Do what you will in the literature. We don't seem to need a Jesus in order to do that. How do you respond?
You want me to hear Robert?
Yeah, Robert.
Well, this was it Renan who said that? No, Voltaire, I think, that said that if Jesus were a fictional invention, whoever invented him would be greater than the invention. Somebody might have theoretically created Jesus, but what the heck? In that case, Jesus becomes the guy that invented him. It's just a question of which name do you want to give him. Tillich said that there had to be a founder of Christianity, even if his name turned out not to be Jesus. He was like on the borderline of mythicism. You know, the great Tillich joke, right, where archaeologists, of course he's gone now, but this is big in his time, the archaeologist from Palestine calls up Tillich. He comes to the Vatican during a big conciliar thing, and he tells the Pope, Your Holiness, I don't really know how to break this news to you, but archaeologists in Palestine have found what is indisputably the remains of Jesus. What are we going to do about this? And the Pope says, well, there's one guy that might be able to help us. Get Paul Tillich on the phone, as they call Union Seminary, and they say, Herr Tillich, this is kind of disturbing, but they've discovered the bones of Jesus. For a few seconds, nothing is heard, and then Tillich says, he lived? But he did say like nothing historically is secure, but it did start with somebody. So if it were Elmer of Nazareth, what the heck? It doesn't really make any difference. And that's sort of like what Voltaire was saying. If it wasn't Jesus, he was better than Jesus, and thus the real Jesus. And there are a bunch of theories like this where people say, okay, it wasn't Jesus. It was really this guy or that guy who Josephus mentions here and there. I've read at least 3 theories like this, and I call theories like that Jesus didn't exist, but somebody did. Is that mythicism or not? It's sort of semantics. I don't know what to make of that, but and I don't know how that bears on the Occam's razor thing too, because in a way, yeah, you don't need it to be Jesus of Nazareth and all that. But if it was somebody, the first guy in line, is that the real Jesus, quote unquote?
Well, let me ask Joe this, because in that vein, okay, reading Caesar's Messiah, totally recommend you get it. If you haven't read it, keep up with the conversation here. You've shown that there are stories in the Gospels that kind of actually is Titus. It parallels Titus's campaign. So to briefly say what I was saying, and then to get to my question, was that you can find practically the entire New Testament, just about, is loaded with the Old Testament stories rewritten. And this is something that you are huge on, Dr. Price. You love to show this. I love to see it because it really scratches, in my opinion, any real notion of real history here. It's just a rewrite of things that are going on. And so whether there was a guy whose name is John in the New Testament, really this is Moses or Elijah, or this is, so and Joe points this out. And I think what Joe's saying, and going a step further, he's not just agreeing with everything you say by saying Homer and the Odyssey, Old Testament, all these obvious parallels. Joe says, guys, let's relook at Josephus. He's been saying this and saying it a lot. And I thought about that. And, it's really taken time for it to sink in my mind, because Josephus, I've heard you say, I've heard even Dr. Carrier say, is utilized in the Gospels. So it's like, all right, not only are they talking about the same war, talking about the similar passages, but I've heard that I think Luke, if I'm not mistaken, or one of the Gospels actually is using something from Josephus. So it kind of just that one extra step to say, what if what Joe's saying about the parallels between the war campaign of Titus and Vespasian is paralleling into the gospel account, which we all admit were written after the war. So really going from there to say, is Jesus this Jewish guy at times, Joe? And then is he also secretly Titus or Vespasian? How are you still thinking the same way as Caesar's Messiah, or have you what's your views to give our audience a little bit?
Well, Jesus isn't Titus. Jesus foresees Titus. The typology you're dealing with just has a kind of Hebraic cartoon. This is the Gospels, right? And Jesus, he goes to the Sea of Galilee, talks about fishing for men, and he just kind of wanders around, has different experiences. And it is only when you compare the character of Jesus with these events in Josephus that you can see that what they have done is they've created basically a person who is foreseeing Titus typologically. So Jesus is not Titus. He is just the forerunner of Titus. That's why you have the parallelisms between the the Old Testament prophets and Jesus, they were forerunners of him. Their historical activity shows up again in Jesus' story, right? Well, this process just goes forward another 40 years, and then Titus actually, has been foreseen. But it's important to recognize that I'm not saying that Jesus is Titus. Jesus is I call him, a Hebraic cartoon character, right? He has just been created to foresee, in the same way that the Old Testament prophets foresaw him, the coming war. And this shouldn't. The way that I think the simplest way to understand it is looking at the Jesus-Moses typology, which is right at the beginning of the Gospels, where it starts out where in Matthew, Joseph goes to Egypt, and then you have Herod massacre the boys, and the divine person says they are dead, which sought the young child's life. And I won't go on, but there's all these events, which are all taken from the Old Testament, right? They're all typologically. So what's happened is that at the beginning you have this connection between basically Jesus and Moses looking backward, right? So Moses' life foresaw Jesus's. So you have a kind of identification of Jesus with this typology as a messianic character, right? He's linked to Moses, and you have all of these linkages between the prophets, these typologic parallelisms between the different prophets, showing the hand of God is at work. Whoever created the Gospels was aware of this and just created Jesus as someone in the genre. So, and then had events constructed so that basically out of the war, so that when Titus, goes through the thing, you can see that he actually is, has the one who's being foreseen by Jesus as the Son of Man who's going to come and be the new Messiah. Now, bear in mind that you have the parallelism of theologic perspective is very clear in the fact that Josephus has a divine revelation at the beginning of the war where he sees a new covenant. He actually says that he has a dream, God talks to him. He's been captured by the Romans, so it's kind of convenient. But he says, you know what? He says, God's favor is not with the Jews anymore, it's with the Romans, right? So this would be the new covenant. And then at the end, Josephus has a famous passage where, he points out that the Jews were mistaken, that it was really this dynasty of the Flavians, the government of Vespasian, that all these messianic prophecies were looking for, right? So if you look at that theologic perspective, right, as having foundation, everything makes perfect sense. You have a new covenant, the human Passover lamb of the new covenant. He's 33 Passover. He has his crucifixion. Passover 73, exactly 40 years later, you have the end of the ownership of Israel by these rebels, and the Son of Man that Jesus foresaw. The identity is just absolutely straightforward because one thing I'm in the chapter I'm going to write on for Roman provenance. I'm going to say, look, the one criticism I have of just New Testament scholars in general is they overlook the power of sequence. Sequence is absolutely potent in terms of being able to demonstrate that there is literary connection. It's very, very powerful. And if you look at the little Jesus-Moses typology, the way that you can see some of the parallels is because they are visible because of the sequence. Sequence enables you, since the sequence is occurring, you can see that, wait a second, that this would link to that. And so it all just makes perfect sense. Well, when you overlay the events of Titus's campaign with Jesus's ministry, you can see that the same sequence has been used at just going forward, where concept, names, location, and sequence are all basically part of this sort of hidden typology that links Josephus and the Gospels, and I don't think it's particularly hard to see, but you have to actually look at it in sequence. That's the main point that I would make, is that, and that's why I rewrote Seers of Messiah, and I made one real big change. I just took the Gospel of Luke and passages from Josephus, and I didn't leap from one gospel to the other because it's confusing. So I just took that gospel and I just laid it out, and I just laid out the passages from Josephus, so that the sequence becomes easier to understand. And that's the main thing I would say, as far as going, like, as New Testament scholarship moves forward, as it tries to make sense of this dividing of theologic perspective that we talked about earlier, about the Roman idea about where Judaism should be, and the Zealot idea about where Judaism should be. Mm-hmm. As we try to understand the literature in that context, I hope that people start to become more interested in sequence as a way of understanding the literature.
Thank you, Joe.
Joe, absolutely great explanation on typology and the role it plays in your book. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about references to Jesus in Josephus and just how that's treated. I don't want to go headlong into it, and yet I want to drop a big bomb here, okay? Because we have the Testimonium Flavianum, which is in Book 18, Section 63, I think it is, from 63 to 65. Dr. Price can correct me on that, but I think that's it. And so if you are a believer, you say, okay, well, here's this evidence in Josephus for Jesus, and it's the Testimonium Flavianum, written by a man who is not a Christian. And you say, okay, now the skeptics, the mythicists, would take a look at that, say, wait a minute, let's examine who wrote it. Okay, that's a fair question. Joseph Atwill would say, and the answer, of course, is Josephus. Joseph Atwill might say, wait a minute, let's look at who invented Josephus, or who might have invented Josephus. So you're taking even a step further back. So I want to talk about this because this is the only man that I know of who was a Pharisee, an Essene, a Sadducee, and a priest in a notoriously bifurcated, vociferous time where you had to be one or the other. These things didn't mix. He happened to be the last one in a cave in a gambit where they drew lots, and he's the guy that survived. And his name happens to be Josephus, which means he shall add. And his role is adding to the fabric of the Roman Empire. That all seems, come on, guys, I'm a skeptic. Was there a real Josephus? I have my doubts. Just weigh in. I mean,
I want to hear
Joe,
Robert on this. Yeah,
Robert,
what do you think, Robert? Was Josephus a nom de plume or not?
Well, this is another one of those things where if he wasn't named Josephus, he could have been named Melvin, but somebody wrote it. And to me, there have been recent articles that I think just consign the Testimonium Flavianum, or as I like to call it, the Testimonium Flimsianum, to the grave, because it's been shown that it doesn't fit in with the sentence structure of the surrounding passages about Pilate. It's been shown that it may well be dependent upon Luke 24 and the dialogue there. It's been shown that the topics in this brief paragraph fit so well with the Eusebian context in which he, the first to quote it, does quote it, that it looks kind of like Eusebius tailored it, created it to fit his argument. And between these things, it just seems to me there's no way it was written by the character of Josephus, assuming that he was a Jew who switched sides and all that. But beyond that, the fact that the Gospels use Josephus kind of rules out the possibility, it seems to me, from another perspective, because and the sequence is interesting too, because you've got in Matthew not just a Moses typology with the nativity, it's that and then some, because it matches Josephus's nativity of Moses more closely than the Exodus original. And it just seems, he's using Josephus here. And then on the other end of it, as I pointed out in Deconstructing Jesus, I guess it was, and Theodore J. Whedon also made, he really unpacked the idea. It seems like the trial narrative of Jesus and really the whole passion narrative is based on Josephus's stories of Jesus Ananias, a prophet who was seditiously predicting the fall of Jerusalem, and how during the siege of Jerusalem some years later, and for this he was dragged before the priests and the Roman procurator, though this was after Pilate's time, flogged, but refused to say anything in his own defense, but he was let go, and he was killed on the wall of the city by a catapult during the siege. And so you've got and all four Gospels give evidence of knowing of the story or actually getting it from Josephus. Well, that's the nativity and the passion narrative on both ends of the Jesus story that seem very likely to have come from Josephus. So he may be a much more important source for the Gospels than anybody has thought. And of course, people don't like to admit that he was, because for one thing, that undermines the historical reality of the gospel story and makes the gospels written a good bit later. But I think it's pretty convincing. And and then that makes me look back at a number of other things that Joe points out in Caesar's Messiah, where they're a little less obvious. You have to dig for them, but they're there. It's just hard to notice them until you get the big picture of Josephus and the dependence on him. Another thing that Joe mentioned about the prophecies of the Son of Man and his coming, and implying that Jesus is predicting someone other than himself, because of course Bultmann said that long ago. The Son of Man is usually in the third person. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth, and so forth? Well, this didn't really dawn on me until recently, where the 40-year gap would make sense as assuming that the Son of Man prophecy was a prediction of Titus and Vespasian, because if you say that the Gospels were written after the destruction of Jerusalem, as I've always thought they were, why would this generation thing give us a deadline for when these things must come to pass, if this was written so long afterward that people knew the Son of Man didn't show up on schedule? Was Jesus wrong? Well, maybe he wasn't talking about himself. He's talking about the unnamed but too obvious Titus business. I just wrote an article for the Journal of Unification Studies called The Synoptic Apocalypse and the Son of Man, where I try to show that when Jesus says that many will come in my name saying I am he, maybe he isn't supposed to mean they're going to be people saying, hey, I'm Jesus, you heard I was coming back and here I am. Could mean that, but suppose it's a later comment trying to rebut Christian claims that Jesus is supposed to be the coming Son of Man. Maybe Jesus is being presented as saying there are people that are going to think that the Son of Man is me, and they'll be expecting my return, but they're wrong. The false prophets will say that. It suddenly hit me, like, if that's what he means, that would fit. He isn't even claiming he's the... the Son of Man. Plus, all the Son of Man stories, like Norman Perrin said long ago, are obviously scribal quotes from Daniel. They're not really quotes from. I mean, they're from a text. All the Son of Man sayings are obviously literary expansions of that thing in Daniel 7. So is there any reason to believe it? Well, okay, if Jesus didn't say this stuff, why did Christians say that he did predict the end would come, the Son of Man would appear by 70? Well, whoever gave that date is talking about the Roman conquest. And why would they not have, if they thought, well, but that's going to be Jesus showing up. Why would they have made such an embarrassingly stupid false prophecy and then let it stand in the text? Maybe that's not what the earlier Christians thought he meant. And who did he mean? Well, who did come in 70?
I have to say, Joe, I want to hand you the mic, but I have to say, this is an amazing conversation. And it seems, I listened to the last one from years ago. You guys have come so far.
Oh,
Joe,
yeah.
what are your thoughts on this? Because I'm loving what Robert's saying. He's saying so many things that the Roman providence is, obviously been trying to get this out there as well, but it's becoming more, I think, taken more serious now, and too many voices are in this now, So,
may I interject?
I think the idea that the Gospels and Josephus share a theological perspective is, I think it's straightforward. It's hard to and particularly like Robert mentioned Goldberg's analysis of the textural construction of the testimony and flimsonium. I love that. And you can see that he's used that whoever's creating the thing is using Luke. Well, you see, and I would also argue that the three crucified, one survived story that Josephus has is also pretty hard to not believe it's somehow related to the gospel. But you see, the problem is that once you start kind of getting these connections, right, that you can basically create through an analysis of the language. Well, now the theological perspective has to be assumed to be coming from the same parallel place. And the theologic perspective is very clear. Josephus sees the new covenant, right? Rome is going to have the love of God, and then he sees the Son of Man being, obviously the Roman Caesar. And I would point out that one question that I've asked people to answer, and I'm going to actually in the book that I'm going to contribute to that Robert's created, going to mention this, is that you have a whole bunch of early Christians. They're called the Christian flavi. Basically, it's everyone who was not in the Gospels, the very first saints. There was a whole collection of these guys, and they're all related in one way or another to the Flavian family. You have Flavia Domitilla, Clement, Neros and Aculus, right? They had churches named after them. And it's not really clear to me that these are real individuals. I mean, are in the sense that they were Christian, but they are, they are subscribed as being the first Catholic saints. And my question is, well, if you ask this group who was the Son of Man Jesus was envisioning, who would they say? Right? I mean, it's to me, it's just, well, how else could you answer it? Wouldn't they be aware that? Wouldn't this group have looked at, say the crucifixion story and seen this as a parallel to what Josephus recorded? And when Jesus predicts, for example, the abomination of desolation, well, Josephus recorded this. Right. He recorded that the daily sacrifice was stopped, and he has a very long explanation about the event. And he says, this is what Daniel saw, right? So you have the overlapping of kind of theological perspective. And moreover, if you read, like, Whiston goes into it, he does the translation of it in the book that I used, and he says, he says that this is a miracle. So this is a flat out miracle because it's occurring exactly at the midpoint of the week, the 7 days between the beginning of the war and when he thinks the war ends. And I would say this is getting
I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, this is getting too perfect, because now then you go forward in Josephus, you go, gee, he's claiming that, like, in 3 years from then, the war ends, and this is exactly the conclusion of the week. Well, it's just this kind of method of trying to link the prophecies together produces, I think, a very clear picture as to the theological perspective of the individual or the group that's coming up with the literature. They're on the side that would be trying to bend the zealots towards Stoicism, I would say, and that group would see. This is the area of the imperial cult. They would see that the Roman Caesar was really who the Messiah, that these prophecies. You see, it's really. It's kind of strange when you stand back from it and think of the Gospels as Roman provenance, because, okay, so I call it a Hebraic tune, but actually, in some ways, it would just be, if you really believed, or were trying to make the case, that the Roman Caesars were gods, they would, therefore, the Messianic prophecies would naturally be linking to them, and then, so then suddenly the creation of the Gospels is just almost axiomatic. It's just like a panegyric, it's just like, we're going to make an homage to the Roman Caesar, and it's this is how you would construct it. So it's I'm going to bet that within a few years, when more like specialists in kind of like typologic language get into, like, looking at the Gospels in that way, that you'll really start to bend quickly toward the Roman provenance theory. I think it's going to be interesting to see, like Robert is organizing this book of a lot of different perspective on Jesus myth. And I'm very curious as to what effect this is going to have on scholarship in general, because I think, I'm biased, but I do think that it's kind of looking to me like there's some disturbance in the force, and I think I wouldn't be surprised.
The last time I felt it was in the presence of my old master.
I wouldn't be surprised if you started seeing a little bit of transition toward, we've got to start looking at the relationship between Josephus and the Gospels more carefully.
Yeah. Hey! I'm all for that, guys. Derek, you had something you want to jump in before?
I agree, man. I don't think I've heard people parallel them. I've heard people say they're using them. I've heard people say, yeah, Josephus is here. But what does that mean? Oh, that's it? So I think there's a lot more there. You're right. That needs to be dug up. Go ahead, Luther.
And again, Derek, you and Joe are tying right into my next question. Let's take another look at Melvin, okay? At Mr. He Shall Add. All right. I'm talking about Josephus. Robert Price called him that, okay? All right. So Melvin's great works, Wars of the Jews and Antiquities of the Jews, published 15 years apart. Can't say that they were written a full 15 years apart, but let's say they may have been written about that time apart, okay? Wars of the Jews being the earlier work. In book 6, Josephus, this guy who's a historian. Well, what's a historian? A guy that deals in facts and biographical information. Great. He talks about these prodigies where you have a sword-shaped star over Jerusalem. You got doors opening by themselves. You have a calf that gives birth to a lamb. This is a historian. Now, if he had gone on an LSD trip and he had maybe written that after his good histories, then you say, look, the guy wrote great history, but then later he went crazy because later he wrote this stuff. No, he wrote that stuff before he wrote Antiquities of the Jews. How can you trust a guy like that to be a historian? He's not a historian. I am a skeptic. I have problems with Melvin? Oh, I'm sorry, Josephus.
Price,
Somebody respond. Somebody.
Well, it seems like the problem with Josephus there is this kind of thing was entirely plausible in his, speaking of the zeitgeist. You wouldn't have to be a nut to believe this. In fact, the opposite might have been true. Just like if you were talking about the shape of the earth and how the planets moved and all that, there are such good reasons observationally to say that the earth is flat and covered by a solid dome with windows in it through which the rain comes. And you said, no, I don't believe that. The earth orbits the sun. The sun is vastly huge. I mean, one guy got in trouble back then for saying the sun might have been a whole 10 miles in diameter. If you didn't stick with the established story, people would think, this guy's crazy. Where on earth does he get this? And of course, you get it because of the telescope and so on, which they didn't have. So Josephus could have considered himself a critical historian and figured, well, people said these things happened. I don't know any better. I guess they did. And then, thousands of years later, people come up with the principle of historical connection and the principle of analogy that says, those things can't be trusted. Not surprising they believed in them, but, if these things happen, why don't they happen now? There's no reason to believe they ever did. They couldn't have seen that yet. So, yeah, he sounded like a competent intellectual with it would sound like today when flying saucer sightings are now being taken seriously by the military and the government. It's like what seemed ridiculous now doesn't sound so bad, and that shifts and changes.
Joe, our dear friend Dia Murdoch, okay,
Yeah.
she's big on astrotheology. She might look at something like this from Josephus and say, hey, what if he's tapping into some type of astrological significance, being they probably had something like that? And, of course, the language comes out pretty blunt, stars that are in the shape of a sword or a calf giving birth to a lamb. We're not saying that actually literally happened. None of us are. And I very much doubt, my opinion, that a historian like him, who's probably well learned, would make those type of things. Do you find any strange stuff with Josephus that you'd like to comment that maybe Luther didn't bring up, but would you agree maybe there's something there on that type of explanation? Or how would you frame that discussion that Luther's bringing up about Josephus being a historian and some of his accounts seem a little bit outrageous?
I think that the events that Josephus recorded that Luther was referring to is just a kind of a way of representing the stuff that Daniel saw and was talking about the coming. And Jesus then talks about the coming of the Son of Man and all kinds of crazy stuff will happen. I think one of the things that Josephus was recording was the clouds that had like an army riding around on it. I mean, I think that's kind of a just a not too, veiled way of like just making sure that people recognize that the prophecies of Daniel that Jesus foresaw are about to take place. I think that the histories of Josephus are, I don't know to what extent are real, but they certainly have been constructed in a way that you can get, the Jesus story to overlay them and make some sense. So when you look at, Josephus' recording of all these strange events, I just think it's a genre that they're getting from Daniel. And Josephus actually then goes on and he says, the events that Daniel foresaw, which are about to occur upon this city. I mean, he just flatly says that. So you don't really, I don't think there's any mystery of where the language, how it's being produced. I think what's important to remember is that it is Daniel's language. And so since it obviously is fiction, these things didn't occur, this means it's just another example of a relationship, a parallelism between the theologic perspective that Jesus is envisioning, right, where Daniel's prophecies are all going to come to pass, and Josephus is recording. What the prophet foresaw, the historian records. This is the basic structure. This is what, of course, Preteritism was based upon, that idea. Josephus was always, or they saw some relationship between Jesus and Josephus's history. And I think that the guys who made this case were reading it very clearly. It's just straightforward. They weren't even looking at sequence. They were just comparing one event to the other. As far as Josephus, the Romans certainly had Jewish intellectuals in the court. I mean, Tiberius Alexander, I don't think anyone disputes that he was a real person and that he was the military general of the Flavian army. And he would have had a lot of theological understanding. I mean, his uncle was Philo, who had tremendous understanding of Jewish literature. So the point here is that to the question is, well, who could have produced the Gospels? And I think that actually the imperial court has to be a strong candidate, because they not only had the technical capacity, this Jewish background, but they had the Roman perspective, obviously. So I think they're like the first place to look for, like theories of authorship. I think obviously it makes sense to look there. As far as the individual Josephus, was he real or not? I mean, who knows? Again, since they're bending history, he could have been a very real person who they tweaked slightly to give him kind of an authoritative persona. I mean, like the idea he was a member of all three Jewish sects seems a little far-fetched. But he could still have been a real person, just slightly tweaked. But I think he was tweaked. I think the character is created in a way to have just you cannot possibly contradict his understanding of history, because particularly of this particular era, because he just has bona fides that are perfect. In other words, he was a general of the Jewish rebellion. He was captured and then became a confidant of the Romans, and then he has his background in Judaism. I mean, that's just an absolutely perfect qualification list. And that's why I suspect it. I don't buy it. I think he was probably a nom de plume, but how would you prove that? It would be impossible.
Mm-hmm.
I love the skepticism. Luther, if you don't mind me. Oh, go ahead, Price, please.
Yeah.
What do you think of the theory that Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to be Joseph Bar Matthias? That if Josephus did have something to do with writing this, that he might have snuck himself in there.
I think they are the same. I actually have that as one of the parallels in Caesar's Messiah, that when there's an episode in Josephus where he begs the Roman commander, a group of three, one guy comes down and he survives. And I just say, look, this is just too many moving parts here, to be anything other than it is close enough for typologic work. In other words, the typologic connection is obvious, and of course, when you look at in terms of sequence, then you can see that the Joseph of Arimathea character was developed to foresee this character that Titus would be with later. And what's interesting is, like in the Gospel of Barnabas, they actually call him Joseph Bar Matthias. They don't.
Wow.
He actually referred to just.
Too long since I read it.
Yeah, in the Gospel of Barnabas, they just flat out say Joseph Bar Matthias, and some people have made the case that Barnabas contains ancient stuff, but I'll let them. I don't really know. But another place that this occurred was in Britain during the. They have a whole legendary series about Joseph of Arimathea coming to Britain. Mm-hmm. Except in that legend, he's called Joseph Bar Matthias. They don't have the Joseph Arimathea designation. He's just Joseph Bar Matthias, and he comes there and he worked, I don't know, miracles, but whatever. So, but so the thing is that in the kind of literature analysis that I try to do, I look at the overall, relationships, because it isn't just, the name of the character. It's the action of the characters, that they beg the Roman commander to have the guy come down, and then one person survives. And it's this combination of parallelism. Nothing is verbatim, but there's enough kind of parallelism to make sense of it. And like Carrier has a way of explaining Joseph of Arimathea, and it's basically focused on a kind of a pun on Bar Matthias. But I see this as weak because he doesn't have any explanation for the word Joseph. And when you look at all of the parallelisms in the passage, then the context is stronger, and this is when I brought out that analysis, oddly enough, I don't think anyone had ever actually done that comparison between Joseph of Arimathea and Joseph Bar Matthias, that passage. At least I wasn't able to find any, because I would have given him citations. I was desperately trying to find some citations before I brought out Caesar's Messiah, because I didn't want to be like the only person who'd ever seen this, because I frankly would look crazy. But I couldn't find anybody who'd ever written about it. And so I was asked about this. People were saying, God, this is very interesting. How did you find it? Like I'm some kind of like literary, sleuth or something. I go, well, actually, I just knew where to look. Once you actually have like the kind of the sequence of the parallelism laid out, where that had to be is only a few hundred words, and that's where the Josephus passage was. And when looking for it, knowing like I was expecting where it would be, that's how I could see it. And then once I saw it, then I could see there's all these different little elements and stuff. And so you had a typologic link, in my opinion.
Joe, go ahead, Price. I see Price has got a question. I'd like his questions more for now.
Yeah, I'd just like to note. Joe's probably thinking you said that you suddenly noticed this thing with the 40 years and all that. I said that in Caesar's Messiah. I don't claim I discovered it. It dawned on me while reading the Creating Christ book just recently, but it's been years since I read Caesar's Messiah, and it's only in retrospect that I realized, oh yes, Joe already said this, and it didn't strike me because I hadn't yet come to understand the big picture as he does, and now more of it makes sense somehow. Reading, I guess, a kind of confirmational thing, plus the idea that it was all typology. I've heard that before in general terms and thought, I am not so sure about that. But now I realize that when I wrote that almost virtually every story in the Gospels seems very plausibly to be a rewrite of an Old Testament story or Homer or whatever, I'm saying the same thing. I just didn't occur. It didn't occur to me to say, well, yeah, this is what they call typology.
Robert, I hate to say it, but I was reading your stuff and I was reading Eisenman's, and that's kind of what my thought world was when I started to look at Josephus and the Gospels. So frankly, you're to blame. And I often say this. I go, don't argue with me. I mean, I just read these books, and then I read and this is what I saw. Go back and argue with Price and Eisenman, because they were the only guys that made any sense to me, and everybody else I thought was kind of silly. And I just, I was raised a Catholic. I was an altar boy. I can still say the Mass in Latin, for God's sake. And I didn't have any bad experience. People always say, I loved the priests. They were wonderful. They were the best. They were the best teachers I ever had. And I went to St. Mary's Military Academy in Tokyo. They were the best teachers. I love those guys. That was one of the reasons why I was so curious about Jesus and Christianity, is even though I'd fallen away from the faith, I had this strong connection to it. But the people who were writing about it just made no sense. It just seemed, I couldn't quite get the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff. Like, well, why? How did this military thing, and then the idea that it was a myth, that it was, that it actually wasn't trying to do history. That was kind of, what happened to me. As I I just fell into bad company, and you know, and
Wow.
I ended up being very skeptical, you know, and so that's I brought that skepticism to you know, to the reading of the thing, and I read reading Josephus because these other guys, Robert and the Roberts, were talking about him. So I read Josephus, and that's when I started saying, wait a second, you know, what's this? Why is this so similar to that? You know, is this a myth? And so anyway, that is what happened, and I think that you know, scholarship is a strange thing. You know, it moves in odd ways, but you get this kind of chain reaction thing where one good idea or even one bad idea, if it's new and different, just starts having an effect. And like I'm saying, I'm telling you, it is the force has been disrupted, and I think it's time for a new look at Christianity.
Well said. Well said. The rivets of the typology seem to be these proper names, you know, and so I could go back to Joseph of arithmetic, or Joseph of aromatherapy, or whatever you want to call it. But this use of proper names in the gospel is something you've paid particular attention to, Joe, as has Professor Robert Eisenman.
Yes.
And although these names were popular among Jewish militants, names like Judas, Simon, Eleazar, Matthias, you talk about all these in Caesar's Messiah. I asked Dr. Eisenman about this, and he says that was a technique, for the most part, aimed at Israel in the diaspora and pagans. Because in Palestine, says Eisenman, they were more concerned with titles and epithets rather than proper names. They wanted to talk about who the righteous one was, or the liar, or Honi the circle drawer, that sort of thing. Because my theory was these names were used in order to unify people who were reading it, even the Jews in Palestine, because, you know, these are the names that get your panties wet. You know, you mentioned Matthew, and oh yeah, I know about him. And, you know, all of a sudden I'm excited, I'm going to listen. But Eisenman says, for the most part, that was directed at Israel in the diaspora and at pagans. So we've only begun to pursue that line of inquiry, haven't we, Joe, about the proper names and the importance in the scheme of things?
Yeah, I mean, this would be something that would be fascinating, and if I had youth and energy, I would probably want to get into it. But I think I'm kind of interested. There's, you know, I get correspondence from scholars, and a lot of them actually are kind of open now, I think, to some of the myth and top-down theories. And so I think that this whole name business is, you know, I mean, again, I have ideas about this, but I've never really completely felt I was able to resolve all of this. You know, the different Simons and Jesuses and all of this. I do think that there's a system. I have to admit that. I actually think that there is a way to actually make sense of that. But at this point, I can't. So I just, what I say is that, in Caesar's Messiah, I say, you know, there's just all these Jesuses. It's deliberate. It makes the reader wonder, you know, like, well, who is Jesus, right? And basically, who can be Jesus, right? And I think that's kind of what I suspect is some of the proper name stuff is they're just showing that you know, that the identity of these people can be maneuvered. They're making a kind of a revelation of method, and the way that I think the clearest example of that is the conclusion of the Gospels, where you have you know, Simon and John, and even that, of course, is disputed, but that those are the disciples Jesus is talking to. But I think it's the straightforward reading of the text. And you know, you have the ending where Simon is condemned, and he's taken where he doesn't want to go and given a death to glorify God, and then John is not, you know, he's not condemned. And this mirrors the fates of the two captured Jewish rebels, Simon and John. And And that was actually one of the parallels that I was intrigued by. And I read Eisenman's comment on it, and he didn't comment on the parallelism between the Johns, but he did notice, Eisenman did notice the parallelism between the Simons. And he wrote something to the effect of, each of these individuals is named Simon. They are the head of a messianic movement about the same time, and they are taken to Rome and executed. And then he asked the question, he goes, how many such individuals could there have been? And the question was to suggest that, well, maybe one is based on the other. And so that would be, I think that would be kind of like the touchstone that you could use to go forward and try to unravel all of the different Simons. And, I think you can actually unravel it, but man, good luck with it. There's stuff in there that's too deep for me.
May I offer a suggestion to anybody that wants to follow this up? I wrote in Deconstructing Jesus a chapter, I think it was called "In the Beginning Was the Deed," and I look at a lot of stuff in the Gospels from the perspective of René Girard, and who talks about the literary doubling of characters, twins, and all that. And I say a bunch of stuff about the Gospel characters, links between Cephas and Caiaphas and things like that. So I'm trying to scratch the surface of that. And then in a symposium collection, I think it's called James the Brother of Jesus, I forget, something like that, maybe just the Brother of Jesus. It was edited, I believe, by Jacob Neusner and Alan Avery Peck. I could be wrong, but I think John Knox Press published this. I have a chapter in it called Eisenman's Gospel of James the Just, and in a section of it called The Name Game, I go into some of this stuff, and I've even gone beyond, which probably means I'm wrong, beyond Eisenman in identifying James the Just with Silas, because that sounds like Salih in the Quran, who and that name means the just. A couple of Arabic words mean that, but he doesn't go that far. But I explain why I think the narrative changes the name at one point, but as soon as we hear the last we're going to hear of James the Just, Paul teams up with Silas to propagate the laws for Gentile Christians living near Jews, which was James's proclamation. And then when Paul splits with Silas, this is the last time we meet James the Just. So Silas fits in exactly between the last two appearances of James. Well, who knows if that's true, but you do keep thinking, boy, what are the chances of this? And the names, I mean, these names sometimes do make a lot of difference. Like, I remember in watching Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, wait a minute, I'm supposed to believe that I thought Lucas was just winging it, that he had no overarching vision, that the thing, Obi-Wan never told you what happened to his father. He told me you murdered him. I am your father. Well, I happen to have Darth Vader right here. And because Darth Vader is like one of these symbolic names, like Han Solo. He's single-handed as a mercenary and all that. Darth Vader supposedly means dark father. And when I realized that, I said, okay, I was wrong. Lucas did have this whole thing in mind, or he would have named him Sam Fern or something instead of. So you always got to take a second look at those names.
Awesome.
Well, Dr. Price, Joe, Luther, I have a question from a fan. I'm going to phrase this the best I can, because I want, guys, ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching this, feel free to contribute, because this is how we make these things happen in Mythvision. We want more of these, guys. So we've only got a little bit more time. I'm going to ask one more. Luther might have one more to ask, and then we're going to wrap it up, because we have got to do part 2, part 3. This is amazing. I love this. Let me get right to it. So in Homer and the Iliad, Peter Bird is the fan. Huge fan of yours, Joe. You know exactly who I'm talking about. He mentioned how scholar, I believe he's a scholar, Neil Godfrey, brings up the Fisher of Men comparison. He talks about how in Homer and the Iliad, it's not just a situation that Titus and them may have had in actual warfare in Josephus. I think you mentioned that in your book, in Caesar's Messiah. But we know that there's the copies of the Old Testament, and then we know there's copies of Homer and the Iliad. This Fisher of Men idea, he talks about in the story of Homer, they actually capture these men, fish these men, and then they cannibalize them. And he's going into this story about how they cannibalize these men. I wanted to ask that. He says the men fished in the Odyssey were cannibalized. It underlies Jesus' words. I will make you fishers of men, cannibals. I don't know. His question is kind of phrasing around that. Do you want to start maybe, Joe, and then maybe you can jump on the back of that with something, Price?
Well, I'll be happy to. Caesar's Messiah doesn't present a box of chocolate in the springtime theology. I mean, because if the Romans did create it, then there's a lot of material in the Gospels that is very dark, and when you have Jesus saying, eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, and then you look, well, what's going on typologically at this point in Josephus, and you have the actual cannibalism of the son of Mary, right? From the house of Hyssop. Now, the house of Hyssop is a pretty good kind of way of designating a Passover lamb. And it's, in the Gospels, you've got, I think they touch him with hyssop and they don't break his legs, and in Josephus, the child is roasted, which is one of the instructions for the preparation of the Passover lamb. And then he's from the house of hyssop. So it's basically looks like the same kind of symbolic construction of a human Passover lamb. In the Gospels, there is this idea that this is metaphorical or spiritual speak, but in Josephus, there's no question, it's just human cannibalism. So that would mean that when you read the Gospels, from the typologic perspective of Josephus, that you have a very grim realism to some of Jesus's words. The spiritualism drops away, and what is left is kind of a Roman dark humor. And so the fishing for men, Jesus, makes the statement at the Sea of Galilee, which is, if you're looking at sequence, this is, an event occurs at that location, and the Jews are in boats. The boats are sunk, and then the Romans catch the Jews, as they try to swim away. So you have as far as the cannibalism phase of it, there are, if you read the Gospels typologically, honestly, you see things that are not pretty. For example, if Jesus's life, the character of Jesus's life is typologic, and then you have the scenes of they put him in a manger. Well, a manger is something that animals eat out of, you see. And so if you get into this realism of cannibalism, then you see there's a humor here which has not been noticed before, which is not, for children. I mean, it's very black. So this is kind of where it gets almost difficult to discuss, because some of the humor, or what strips away when the spiritualism is gone, is not pretty. And Peter's comment about that there is a cannibalism kind of underneath the symbol is, unfortunately, something I would agree with. In Caesar Messiah, I did not bring up, or just to the smallest degree I could, the dark humor. I think that will be something I'm going to leave to other people who want to take on the task, because it's very difficult. And you see, when there's so many people who see the beauty of the language of the Gospels, to take them immediately to this other way of reading it is, I think, it's just very emotionally upsetting, and it's not something I think is really useful or beneficial, in my opinion. I think transition is appropriate, and so, I think Peter is right, but it's not something I really want to go into any further than that.
Okay, thank you. Price, do you have any ideas on that?
Well, it would certainly be of a piece with the whole approach of saying that the underlying events, or stories at least, may have been seditious to tell or retell, and given the makeover of Jesus as gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and all that, that is one context in which you could see this sanitizing happening, like why there would be a disturbing subtext of it that somebody felt they needed to change into something more pious. And in fact, there's something, this is pretty vaguely similar, but it occurs to me, in Matthew 23, where you have Jesus denouncing the Pharisees, he says, you scour land and sea to make even one convert, and when you've done it, you've made him twice as much a son of the devil as you yourselves are. That
Ooh.
almost sounds like, because the fishers of men, as we now read it, has to do with evangelizing and all that. It's not the same thing, but it seems to be a similar association of ideas, and you never know what. Sometimes that's all it took, just a code word, a catchword, to provide a different slant on it. So that's not so implausible.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, have we come to the last question? Derek, I get the last question?
You get you take us out, brother.
Well, look, man, it's gonna be the last one tonight, because I'd like to do this again. How do you guys feel about it, Joe, Robert?
Oh, it's an honor to be on with Joe as well as you two. I'd be pleased to do it.
The honor is all mine. I actually, I hate to say it, I would love, well, you guys wouldn't. I would love to just interview Robert, because I have so many questions that I'd love to pick his brain, but that may be down the line. But yeah, anytime you get Robert, you can just count on me. I just love to just listen to him talk. It's like I was when
super.
So yeah, I'd love to do that.
Super. All right, last question. Let's go back to Eisenman's schema about pro-Roman, anti-Roman groups, and I want to focus in on two. I'm writing about this in my current book. The Herodians and the Essenes. Pro-Roman, the Herodians. The Essenes, anti-Roman. Diametrically opposed to one another, morally, politically, and with respect to ethnic purity. They are also represented by opposite signs of the zodiac. The Herodians are represented by Leo the lion. On the opposite side, you've got Aquarius. All of this is in the book. What I find interesting is that the Herodians had this scribal tradition. There is such a thing as Herodian script. So they had their own script. And if you read, as I'm reading currently, William Beeston's work, The Roman Empire, the Empire of the Edomite, he says that the Herodians and the Romans had a common heritage. That's fascinating. A common ancestry for the Herodians and the Romans. And the Essenes on the opposite side also had a scribal tradition, obviously, one that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you got Paul, who, according to the book of Romans, was a kinsman of the Herodians and a part of that scribal tradition. Do you guys think that knowledge of this Herodian connection could hold an important key to Paul's life and work? Do we need to explore that further? Just your closing thoughts on that.
Well, Eisenman wrote an article for the Journal of Higher Criticism some years ago called Paul as Herodian, where he does go into that a good bit. And that becomes a piece of one of his books. It might be the New Testament Code. I forget now, though. But he comes up with more out of that than I would have expected.
Okay. Joe, and any thoughts on the Herodian connection?
Sure. Well, I would like to see brought into that whole study some speculation, at least, on the cult of Veronica that they found in the Herodian palace, I guess, or right outside of it, because Veronica means it's Latin for Veronica, and so. Since she's actually mentioned in the New Testament, and she was Titus's girlfriend, I think that the cult of Veronica was relating to her. And there's actually archaeologic stuff that guys have done. They've gone there and looked at this. But I would love to see, if you want to just do the acid bath test of like how it would look, just right from the perspective that Paul is a Herodian. Just write it. Just look at that. He is, and this is and he's using a little bit of soap, a little bit of this, and just lay that out there, and I think you'd get a different kind of Paul. So
right.
That'd be the kind of now. This is the kind of book that I like to read. I love to read stuff like this. So if you get it, close in a draft, please send it to me. I'll definitely check it
out. For sure. I will, Joe. I will.
Yeah.
Well, hey guys. We could not have hoped for a better conversation. Would you agree, Derek?
Yeah. Oh, man, dude. Guys, this was definitely something we've been wanting to see, especially on this level. So did our fans. So let's have this happen again.
Sure.
Available anytime at all.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Quick information. How do we get in touch with you guys? How do our viewers and listeners contact you? Email, Facebook, online?
The best for me would be email, and it's Criticus, CRITICUS at AOL.com.
Very good. How about you, Joe?
Just send me emails to joeatwill@gmail.com.
Sounds great.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be a piece, and I'm going ahead and telling you forthright in the Journal of Higher Criticism that Price is going to release that Joe Atwill has written at some point. I'm giving you a heads up. Go support the Journal of Higher Criticism on Amazon. I'm going to have to go and surf through some links, put them all in the description. You guys can go shopping, checking out the books, checking out the links. Support these guys in any way you can.
I'm lucky. I have a kind of a fortunate circumstance, but anyone who isn't supporting Robert Price is not a friend of New Testament scholarship. So please, let's all support Robert so that the Journal of Higher Criticism and more books. My God, he can write like one a month or something. So this should be all just part of going forward. So let's do it.
Make sure you support Melvin Price. And thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Yep.
All right. See you soon. Joe Atwill, Dr. Robert Price.
Yeah, the force be with you.